In the dim, flickering light of a forgotten attic in rural Georgia, a young historian named Elena Vargas knelt amid dust-choked crates, her gloved hands trembling as she pried open a rusted tin box. It was 2023, and what she uncovered wasn't just yellowed papers or faded photographs. It was a ledger, its pages brittle and stained, detailing experiments that no history book had ever dared to mention. At the center of those frantic handwritten notes was a single name: Lyra, a slave girl, barely 14, whose body bore a curse that baffled the plantation's elite and in time unraveled a web of horrors buried deeper than the roots of the cotton fields. Her skin, they wrote, was a map of madness, blotched and peeling in patterns that defied nature, a disease so grotesque it was whispered to be the devil's mark. But Lyra's affliction wasn't mere illness. It was the key to a forbidden secret, one that promised immunity to the plagues ravaging the South, forged in the shadows of human suffering. Before we delve deeper into this tale, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Here, we unearth secrets long buried by official history and give voice to the silenced stories that demand to be heard. The year was 1847, and the sprawling hawthorn plantation stretched like a scar across the red clay hills of central Georgia. Under a relentless sun, hundreds toiled in the fields, their lives chained to the whims of Elias Hawthorne, a man whose fortune was built on cotton and cruelty. Hawthorne was no ordinary planter. He was a visionary of sorts, obsessed with the science of survival in an era when yellow fever and malaria claimed lives as casually as the overseer's whip. Whispers among the enslaved spoke of his midnight gatherings in the big house, where he pored over smuggled books from Europe, treatises on bloodlines and inheritance, dreams of breeding a race resistant to the South's invisible killers. But those dreams came at a cost, one hidden from the ledgers that tallied bales of cotton and bushels of corn. Lyra arrived at Hawthorne in the spring of that year, bartered from a neighboring estate like so many others. She was small, her dark eyes wide with the quiet terror of the uprooted, her skin already showing faint, irregular patches, milky white against her deep brown, as if frost had kissed her in the height of summer. The overseers called it the White Blight, a mocking name for what they saw as weakness, but Elias Hawthorne saw potential. He had her isolated in a small cabin at the edge of the quarters, away from the communal fires, where stories of escape and endurance were shared in hushed tones. There, under the guise of healing, he began his observations, sketching her afflictions in a private journal that would later vanish into family attics, only to resurface a century and a half later. The plantation's rhythm masked the growing unease. Dawn broke with the clang of bells, summoning the hands to the rows where bowls burst like wounds under calloused fingers. Children too young for full labor darted between legs, gathering stray fibers, while the women, bent double, backs glistening, sang low melodies of rivers and freedom, their voices a fragile thread against the silence imposed by fear. Elias Hawthorne moved among them like a spectre, his sharp features framed by a wide-brimmed hat, his eyes lingering not on the yield, but on the bodies. He spoke often of legacy, of building an unbreakable line to outlast the fevers that had claimed his first wife and 2 sons. To the outside world, he was a pillar of the community, hosting suppers for local gentry where brandy flowed and talk turned to tariffs and tariffs alone. But in the privacy of his study, maps of bloodlines adorned the walls, charts linking enslaved families in ways that twisted kinship into strategy. It started small, the signs of the secret. A midwife, old Mama Roo, was summoned more frequently to the big house, her herbal poultices replaced by Hawthorne's insistent questions about lineages from Africa, about survivors of old epidemics. She noticed the changes in Lyra, the girl's skin worsening, flaking in scales that glowed unnaturally under lantern light, her fevers breaking only to return fiercer. Mama Roo tried to comfort her, slipping cornbread through the cabin door, murmuring prayers in a tongue long forbidden. "Hold on, child," she'd whisper. "The ancestors see." But Lyra's cries echoed into the night, drawing wary glances from the quarters. Rumors spread like kudzu. Was it witchcraft? A punishment from the spirits for some unspoken sin? The men in the fields lowered their eyes when overseers passed, sensing the air thicken with unspoken dread. Hawthorne's wife, Clara, played her part in the facade. Pale and pious, she organized prayer meetings for the enslaved, her Bible readings laced with verses on obedience and divine order. Yet Clara knew fragments of her husband's pursuits, enough to turn away when Lyra was paraded before a select few visitors, her body a living exhibit of the miracle strain Elias claimed to be cultivating. It was a program veiled in euphemisms, pairings arranged not by affection but by traits, forced unions to blend what Hawthorne called resilient stock. Lyra, with her anomalous skin, became the linchpin, her disease studied not for cure, but for replication, a supposed immunity that allowed her to shrug off mosquito bites that felled others. Whether it was true or delusion, Hawthorne believed it, documenting fevers survived and infections repelled, all while the girl's health frayed like old rope. The community of the enslaved bore the weight in silence. Families were sundered without explanation, husbands sent to distant auctions, mothers left to grieve in the dark. Old grievances simmered, memories of a failed uprising a decade prior, quelled by betrayal from within, the ringleaders punished publicly to etch fear into every soul. No one spoke of Lyra openly, but in the stolen moments after curfew, elders passed warnings. "The master's playing God," one grizzled field hand muttered to his kin, "and God's wrath comes slow." The silence extended beyond the quarters. Neighboring planters turned blind eyes, their own ledgers hiding similar shadows. Official records from the county seat noted only bountiful harvests and tithes to the church, erasing the human toll as neatly as a erased chalk mark. As summer bled into fall, Lyra's condition escalated. The patches spread, her skin cracking like parched earth, drawing flies that buzzed with morbid curiosity. Hawthorne's journal entries grew frantic, cross-referenced with letters from a Philadelphia doctor who warned of hereditary anomalies, but urged caution. Yet caution was a luxury Elias couldn't afford. Yellow fever had struck nearby estates, emptying fields and coffers. He doubled his efforts, isolating Lyra further, her world shrinking to the cabin's four walls and the probing hands of those he trusted. In the fields, productivity dipped as whispers of unrest grew, tools misplaced, work slowed to a crawl. The overseers cracked down, their lashes a grim reminder of the order Hawthorne's experiments threatened to upend. By harvest's end, the first disappearance occurred. Not Lyra, but a young woman from the weaving shed, paired against her will in Hawthorne's scheme, vanished into the night. Her kin searched the swamps, finding only a bloodied cloth snagged on briars. The official story, runaways to the north. But in the quarters, eyes turned to the big house, where lights burned late and shadows moved with purpose. Lyra from her window watched it all, her diseased gaze a silent witness to the unraveling. Little did they know, her affliction held the thread that would, generations later, pull the entire tapestry apart, revealing not just immunity, but the monstrous cost of a family's hidden pact with power. The weight of those unspoken truths hung heavy, a pall over the plantation that no amount of cotton could lift. And as the years turned to decades, the secrets of Hawthorne Plantation sank into the soil, waiting for someone like Elena to dig them free. Winter deepened its grip on Hawthorne Plantation, the frost etching brittle patterns on the cabin windows where Lyra huddled under threadbare quilts. The year 1848 dawned with a bitter chill that seeped into bones already weary from endless toil. But for Elias Hawthorne, it brought a feverish resolve. His private chambers in the big house overflowed with pilfered volumes, treatises on genetics smuggled from distant universities, annotated with his own scrawled theories. He paced the creaking floors at night, muttering about the unyielding strain, convinced that Lyra's peculiar affliction was no curse but a divine endowment, a shield against the fevers that prowled the lowlands like unseen predators. Yellow fever had ravaged a neighboring county that fall, claiming dozens in a haze of delirium and death. Yet reports from Hawthorne's spies spoke of survivors among the enslaved whose bloodlines intertwined with anomalies like Lyra's. It fueled his obsession, turning the plantation into a clandestine laboratory where humanity was reduced to variables in an equation of endurance. Lyra's days blurred into a monotonous agony. Confined to her isolation, she traced the spreading blotches on her arms with trembling fingers, the skin pulling taut and splitting in places, a constant itch that no salve could soothe. The white blight, as the overseers sneered, now covered her shoulders and neck, flaring under the touch of the winter winds that whistled through the cabin's gaps. Hawthorne visited daily, his presence a shadow that chilled more than the cold. He prodded her gently at first, noting how mosquito swarms ignored her while they feasted on others nearby, or how a bout of ague that swept the quarters left her untouched amid the coughing and chills. "You're the key, child," he'd say, his voice a mix of awe and command, forcing her to swallow bitter tonics brewed from roots and rumors. But the girl, whose real name had been stripped away upon arrival, remembered fragments of a life before, songs from a mother's lap, the warmth of a fire shared with siblings. Now those memories were her only refuge, whispered to the walls as her body betrayed her. The program Hawthorne orchestrated expanded in secrecy, veiled under the routine of plantation life. He selected pairs from the enslaved with deliberate care, drawing on Mamaru's reluctant knowledge of family trees that stretched back to the Middle Passage. A strong field hand, with a history of shrugging off malaria, was matched to a woman whose kin had endured smallpox scars without succumbing. These unions were not celebrated with joy, but enforced in the dim light of barns or remote cabins. The weight of refusal met with swift separation, children auctioned off, kin scattered like chaff in the wind. Clara Hawthorne turned a blind eye, her days filled with embroidery and church visits, but whispers reached her ears during afternoon teas with other wives. "Elias is building something eternal," she'd deflect with a tight smile, her piety a fragile armor against the unease gnawing at her conscience. Yet she participated in small ways, distributing rations that masked experimental herbs, her hands steady as she enforced the isolation of those deemed valuable stock. In the quarters, the human cost mounted like unspoken debts. Families fractured under the strain. A young couple, newly paired by Hawthorne's design, found their infant born with faint patches echoing Lyra's curse, milky blooms on tender skin that drew horrified stares. The mother, Etta, clutched the child close, her songs of lullabies turning to laments in the night. "What have they done to us?" she'd sob to the women gathered around the washtubs, their hands raw from scrubbing linen stained with sweat and sorrow. The elders, scarred by years of survival, urged caution, tales of past betrayals, when informants traded secrets for favors, leading to public punishments that left welts as warnings. One such elder, old Silas, a blacksmith whose hammers rang with quiet defiance, gathered the men by the forge after dusk. "The master's pact ain't with God or man, it's with the devil's own bargain," he growled, his voice low against the crackle of embers. "We hold our tongues, but our blood remembers." Their resistance simmered in subtle acts, tools dulled just enough to slow the plough, seeds scattered unevenly to thin the yield, a quiet erosion of the empire built on their backs, Official records from the county maintained the illusion of prosperity. Tax ledgers brimmed with inflated figures, church donations flowed to whitewashed pews, and Elias Hawthorne's name appeared in gazettes as a benefactor of progress. But beneath the surface, cracks formed. A traveling preacher, invited for a revival, caught glimpses of Lyra during a midnight summons to the big house, her form shrouded, but her afflicted skin glowing faintly in the candlelight. He preached fire and brimstone the next day, his sermons laced with veiled condemnations of unnatural pursuits, but Hawthorne's donation silenced further probing. The preacher departed with coin in his pocket and questions buried, another thread in the web of complicity that bound the community. Local elites, from merchants to magistrates, shared in the silence. Their own plantations harbored similar shadows, economies propped up by the denial of suffering. As spring thawed the earth, Lyra's condition shifted unpredictably. The blotches receded in patches, only to erupt elsewhere. Her fevers now accompanied by visions, ghostly figures from the ancestors, urging her to endure. Hawthorne documented it all in his hidden journal, cross-referencing with letters from that Philadelphia contact who cautioned that such traits might carry a heavier toll, a fragility masked by resilience. Undeterred, Elias pressed on, incorporating Lyra into the pairings as a symbol of hope, though her youth spared her the worst, for now. The disappearance of Etta's sister followed, the weaver from the previous year, her absence chalked up to fever, but a locket found in the swamp mud told another tale, engraved with a plea for freedom that never came. The plantation's air grew thicker with dread, the cotton rose a labyrinth of lowered eyes and hurried steps. Mama Roo, risking all, smuggled a charm to Lyra. A small pouch of earth from the ancestors' homeland, whispered to ward off the master's grasp. "Your mark ain't madness, child. It's a sign," she murmured through the door. But the girl's responses grew fainter, her spirit fraying like the hems of her shift. In the big house, Hawthorne dreamed of a legacy immune to plague, blind to the poison seeping into his own veins, ambition that would echo through generations, silenciato only by time's indifferent march. Decades later, Elena Vargas would pore over these fragments, her fingers tracing the faded ink, piecing together how one girl's affliction exposed not just a disease, but a deliberate perversion of life itself. The secrets of Hawthorne lingered, buried in the red clay, awaiting the light that Lyra's silent endurance demanded. Summer's relentless heat returned to Hawthorne Plantation in 1849, turning the air into a thick, humid shroud that clung to every breath. The cotton fields shimmered like mirages, the boles swelling under the sun's unyielding gaze, but the rhythm of labor felt fractured, as if the land itself sensed the deepening rot at its core. Elias Hawthorne's experiments had evolved into a shadowed ritual, his study now a sanctum of charts and vials, where the air smelled of ink and something sharper, desperation masked as discovery. Lyra, now 15, remained the unwilling heart of it all, her skin a living testament to his theories. The white blight had stabilized in cruel patterns, patches that gleamed like frost on her limbs, repelling the swarms of insects that tormented the others. Hawthorne proclaimed it a breakthrough in hushed conferences with select allies, a natural barrier forged in the fires of heritage, promising a lineage that could defy the South's spectral plagues. From her cabin, Lyra watched the world through warped glass, her isolation a cage woven from fear and curiosity. The fevers that gripped the quarters left her untouched, her body a fortress, while neighbors succumbed to chills that rattled bones and stole breaths. But the cost etched itself deeper. Her joints ached with an unnatural weariness, as if the immunity drained her vitality drop by drop. Mama Roo's visits grew rarer, the old woman's steps cautious against the overseer's watchful eyes. When she came, it was with furtive glances, pressing dried leaves into Lyra's palms. remedies whispered to be from the old ways, meant to ease the peeling that left her raw and exposed. "Your mark carries the strength of rivers crossed," Mama Ru would say, her voice a thread of solace in the gloom. Yet Lyra's dreams turned haunted, visions of chains linking souls across oceans, a chorus of ancestors demanding she bear witness to the perversion unfolding. Hawthorne's program of selective pairings intensified, a clandestine machinery grinding against the fabric of lives already frayed. He consulted his ledgers like a prophet, tracing bloodlines through generations of the enslaved, seeking echoes of resilience in scars and survivals. A blacksmith with unyielding lungs, survivor of a cholera outbreak years prior, was bound to a seamstress whose family had outlasted the pox. These arrangements unfolded in the hush of twilight, enforced by threats that loomed larger than the whip, families torn asunder, futures bartered for the illusion of progress. Clara Hawthorne, ever the silent sentinel, oversaw the distribution of fortifying rations, her hands trembling slightly as she measured out grains laced with Hawthorne's concoctions. In her private moments, she penned letters to distant kin, vague allusions to her husband's noble pursuits. But the ink blurred with unshed tears, her complicity a chain she forged link by link. The quarters simmered with a quiet storm, the human toll manifesting in stolen glances and coded songs. Etta's child, now toddling with those faint, milky blooms on its skin, became a symbol of the unspoken curse, hidden from the overseer's rounds, lest it draw Lyra's fate upon them. Whispers circled the evening fires, tales of a pact Elias had struck in his youth, a forbidden alliance with a Charleston physician who peddled secrets of inheritance for gold. "He sold our blood for his immortality," old Silas confided to a circle of trusted men, his hammer idle in the forge's dying light. Resistance flickered in small rebellions. A plowshare bent just so, delaying the harvest. Herbs slipped into the master's stew to sour his nights. But fear bound them tighter than irons. Memories of the uprising long past lingered, its leaders' fates a grim tapestry of public correction and vanished kin. The community, forged in shared suffering, held its collective breath, their silence a shield and a shroud. Beyond the plantation's borders, the facade held firm. County records painted Hawthorne as a paragon, his yields envied in the gazettes, his contributions to local militias lauded at assemblies, yet cracks whispered through the elite circles. A magistrate's wife, overhearing fragments at a supper, raised an eyebrow but accepted a bribe disguised as charity. The travelling preacher returned that spring, his sermons sharper now, decrying tamperings with the Lord's design. But Hawthorne's influence quelled the storm before it broke. Letters exchanged with the Philadelphia doctor grew urgent, warnings of unforeseen frailties in such engineered lines dismissed as envy. Elias, undaunted, expanded his notes to include Lyra's vital signs, sketching her form as a blueprint for the future, blind to the girl's fading spark. Another shadow fell in midsummer. The disappearance of the blacksmith, pulled from his pairing after a fever brushed him, too close a call for Hawthorne's calculations. His wife searched the swamps at dawn, calling his name into the mist, finding only a broken chain link glinting in the mud. The official tale spun of desertion, a runaway chasing northern lights, but in the quarters, grief hardened into resolve. Lyra, overhearing the cries from her window, felt a stir within, a defiance born of her own endurance. She began etching symbols on the cabin walls, faint scratches from scavenged charcoal, maps of the affliction that mirrored the stars she glimpsed at night. Mama Ru discovered them one evening, her eyes widening with recognition. "These are the signs of the unbroken," she breathed, urging Lyra to hide them, lest they fuel the master's fire. As the heat peaked, Hawthorne's health began to falter, a persistent cough shadowing his steps. A irony lost on him as he chased eternal vigor. He confided in Clara during rare, tender moments, speaking of a legacy that would shield their name from plague's grasp, but her responses grew distant, haunted by the faces of those reshaped by his hand. The plantation's prosperity masked the unraveling. Yields soared, yet the soil seemed to resist, weeds choking the rows as if protesting the blood fed into it. In the modern glare of Elena Vargas's attic workspace, these threads began to weave together. The ledger she unearthed detailed not just observations but confessions, Hawthorne's own admissions of the pact, a bargain with science and silence that doomed generations. Elena traced Lyra's lineage through faded census scraps, finding descendants scattered across the south, their stories laced with unexplained ailments echoing the original curse. Interviews with elders in nearby towns revealed oral fragments, tales of a girl with star-marked skin whose survival mocked the fevers but invited deeper chains. The immunity Hawthorne sought proved illusory, a fleeting shield crumbling under the weight of exploitation, its true revelation buried in the bones of the forgotten. The Hawthorne secrets, once silenced by complicit pens and fearful tongues, clawed toward the surface, demanding reckoning. Lyra's endurance, a quiet flame in the dark, illuminated the cost of ambition unchecked, a legacy of pain that time could not fully erase. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced reports reach. Autumn's golden haze settled over Hawthorne Plantation in 1850, the leaves curling like clenched fists against the encroaching chill, but the air carried a tension thicker than the harvest's bounty. Elias Hawthorne's pursuits had woven deeper into the fabric of daily existence, transforming the sprawling fields into an unwitting stage for his grand delusion. The big house loomed as a sentinel of secrets, its verandas echoing with the measured steps of overseers who now patrolled with renewed vigilance, their eyes scanning not just for idleness, but for signs of fracture in the carefully curated order. Lyra, 16 now, had become a spectral figure in her cabin, her skin's affliction a mosaic of resilience and ruin, patches that shimmered with an otherworldly sheen, warding off the autumn agues that felled field hands in droves. Hawthorne's journal brimmed with exaltations, entries scrawled in a hand increasingly erratic, proclaiming her the vessel of an unbreakable lineage, a immunity etched into flesh that could defy the fever's relentless siege. From the confines of her isolation, Lyra's world narrowed to the play of shadows on the walls, her etched symbols a private rebellion against the void. The white blight had claimed more territory, creeping across her torso in irregular blooms that itched with phantom fires, yet it shielded her from the maladies that whispered through the quarters like ghosts. A wave of influenza swept the plantation that fall, leaving cabins empty and graves hastily dug at the field's edge. But Lyra endured, her survival a quiet indictment of Hawthorne's tampering. Mama Roo, her visits shadowed by risk, brought tales from the outside, whispers of unrest in distant cities, abolitionist pamphlets smuggled south like contraband hope. "The winds are shifting, child," the old woman murmured, her fingers tracing Lyra's marked skin with reverence rather than revulsion. "Your endurance calls to those who listen." But Lyra's responses were sparse, her voice a fragile echo, burdened by visions that blurred the line between memory and prophecy, chains dissolving in river currents, ancestors nodding in approval of her unyielding spirit. Hawthorne's program of forced alliances reached a fevered pitch, a web of calculated bonds that snared lives like vines overtaking the oaks. He pored over his bloodline charts by candlelight, linking survivors of past epidemics with those bearing subtle anomalies, convinced that blending them would birth a fortified generation. A young woman from the kitchen, her family known for outlasting droughts and diseases alike, was yoked to a driver whose vigor had mocked consumption's grasp. These pairings unfolded in the hush of secluded groves, the weight of coercion hanging like mist, met with separations that shattered kinships. Siblings auctioned to border states, elders left to mourn in solitude. Clara Hawthorne's role deepened into quiet enforcement. Her afternoons spent cataloguing responses to the fortifying measures, her ledger noting vitalities with clinical detachment. Yet in the still hours, doubt eroded her resolve. She confided fragments to a locked diary, allusions to the heavy price of progress, her faith fracturing under the strain of witnessed sorrows. In the quarters, the collective grief coalesced into an undercurrent of defiance, the human spirit bending but not breaking under the yoke. Etta's child, now a spirited toddler with those echoing milky patches, scampered among the children, a living emblem of the altered fates. Mothers gathered at the well, their conversations laced with coded laments, songs of parted lovers twisted into warnings of the master's designs. Old Silas, his forge a haven for murmured counsels, sharpened tools with deliberate strokes, his words forging resolve. This pact he keeps ain't sealed in heaven, it's writ in our scars, and scars tell tales, he said to a huddle of men, their faces etched with the lines of unspoken rage. Subtle sabotages multiplied, harnesses loosened to halt the wagons, cotton bowls trampled underfoot in the dusk, acts of erosion that chipped at Hawthorne's empire without inviting the lash's full fury. The memory of betrayals past loomed large, a kin sold for speaking out, punishments meted in the yard to instill terror, but it fueled a deeper vigilance, families binding closer in the face of division. The plantation's veneer of normalcy extended to the wider world, where Hawthorne's name shone in county dispatches as a steward of abundance. Harvest festivals drew neighbors, their toasts to prosperity drowning out the faint cries from the edges of the grounds. A circuit judge, visiting for a routine inquest, glimpsed Lyra during a tour of the model quarters, her form veiled, but her presence stirring unease in his ledger notes, quickly amended with a generous contribution to the courthouse fund. Exchanges with the Philadelphia correspondent turned ominous, the doctor's letters pleading restraint against the perils of overreach, and tales of failed experiments in northern labs where pursuits like Hawthorne's had birthed frailty rather than fortitude. Elias dismissed them as rivals' envy, his cough worsening into nights of fitful rest, an unwitting harbinger of the toll his ambitions exacted. Winter's approach brought another vanishing, the seamstress from the prior union, her absence discovered at dawn when her workstation stood barren, threads trailing like unfinished pleas. Her husband scoured the underbrush, unearthing a scrap of fabric torn by thorns, but the overseers spun the narrative of flight northward, quelling questions with threats of reprisal. In the quarters, suspicion hardened toward the big house, where Hawthorne's silhouette paced late, blueprints of blood unfurling like dark prophecies. Lyra, sensing the ripples, added to her wall etchings, symbols of unity, circles linking the afflicted, a map of resistance born from her solitude. Mama Rue, discovering the new marks, pressed a hidden token into her hand, a carved root from the old lands, said to amplify the ancestors' watch. "Hold the light within," she urged, her eyes fierce with borrowed courage. As frost rhymed the fields, Hawthorne's obsession crested in a clandestine gathering, inviting trusted allies to witness Lyra's miracle. Under cover of night, they examined her, murmuring of potentials that could secure the South's dominion over plague, their complicity sealing another layer of silence. Clara observed from the shadows, her heart a tumult of loyalty and lament. The weight of her silence, a chain heavier than any forged in the smithy. Centuries on, Elena Vargas sifted through the attic's remnants, her lamp casting long shadows over the journal's revelations. Faded entries detailed the gatherings, the alliances that perpetuated the program. linking Lyra's line to descendants who carried faint echoes of the blight. Stories unearthed in oral histories where elders spoke of a girl's mark as both blessing and burden. Court archives from a long-forgotten dispute yielded fragments. A Hawthorne heir's vague confession in 1892, hinting at the experiments that shadowed the family name. Interviews with modern kin revealed patterns, unexplained resiliences amid recurring ailments, a legacy of survival laced with loss. The immunity Hawthorne chased proved a mirage, its pursuit a betrayal that scarred generations, its truth emerging not in triumph, but in the slow unveiling of buried pains. The Hawthorne shadows stretched long, their persistence a testament to the silenced voices that refused oblivion. Lyra's quiet defiance, etched in skin and symbol, beckoned the light of reckoning, illuminating the fragile line between endurance and erasure. The first whispers of spring stirred Hawthorne Plantation in 1851, thawing the frost-kissed earth into a reluctant bloom. But the awakening brought no renewal, only a sharper edge to the shadows that had taken root. The cotton rows, dormant through winter, now demanded resurrection, their furrows a grim reminder of the lives bent to till them. Elias Hawthorne, gaunt from his lingering cough, moved with a fervour that bordered on mania, his study a chaos of expanded charts where lines of descent twisted like brambles. Lyra's affliction had become his lodestar, the white blight now a constellation across her form, iridescent patches that gleamed defiantly against the pallor of confinement, repelling the early mosquitoes that heralded summer's plagues. He scrawled in his journal of perfected resilience, convinced that her survival through the winter's grip on influenza proved the strain's supremacy, a shield woven from the very essence of endurance he sought to propagate. Lyra, 17, and hollowed by isolation, pressed her palms against the cabin's rough-hewn walls, feeling the etched symbols pulse like veins beneath her skin. The disease had evolved into a relentless companion, the blotches flaring with the season's shift, cracking open to weep a clear fluid that hardened like resin under the sun's tentative rays. Yet it spared her the coughs that echoed from the quarters, where families huddled against the remnants of winter's toll, their numbers thinned by unmarked graves. Her world, reduced to slivers of sky through the barred window, filled with the distant clamour of revival, axes splitting wood for new fences, the lowing of mules yoked to ploughs. Mama Rue's clandestine visits sustained her, the old woman slipping through the underbrush with poultices of willow bark and wild honey, her tales a lifeline to the unseen. "The roots run deep, child, deeper than his digging," she whispered one dawn, binding Lyra's wounds with cloth scented of earth. But the girl's eyes, once bright with unspoken questions, now held a distant veil, her dreams a torrent of fragmented visions, rivers swelling with the cries of the uprooted, stars aligning in patterns that mocked the master's maps. Hawthorne's veiled program burgeoned into a labyrinth of control, ensnaring more souls in its calculated web. He delved deeper into the enslaved's histories, interrogating elders under the guise of benevolence, piecing together lineages from whispers of African shores, where fevers had spared the hardy. A laundress with unscarred lungs, descendant of those who weathered the crossing storms, was aligned with a carpenter whose kin had defied the sweat that claimed plantations whole. These enforced bonds transpired in the veiled seclusion of outbuildings, the air heavy with coercion's unspoken threats, offspring rerouted to isolation, kin dispersed to auctions that severed ties like shears through cloth. Clara Hawthorne, her features drawn by accumulating shadows, managed the periphery with mechanical precision, tallying responses to the laced provisions that promised vigor but delivered unease. In stolen solitude, she burned fragments of correspondence, her husband's letters to distant scholars, hinting at elevated pursuits. But the smoke carried her quiet remorse, a futile offering to the conscience she could no longer ignore. The quarters pulsed with a veiled undercurrent of solidarity, the human spirit coiling like roots against the press of oppression. Etta's child, a wiry 5-year-old with those faint inherited blooms fading into normalcy, darted through the lanes, a spark of unaltered joy amid the gloom. Women at the cook fires wove cautionary rhythms into their work songs, melodies of parted streams that doubled as maps of hidden paths north. Old Silas, his once steady hands now gnarled further by age, convened the men in the forge's smothered glow, his voice a forge of its own. "This ain't legacy he's building, it's a cage for our blood, and cages rust with time," he intoned, eyes scanning for eavesdroppers. Their defiance manifested in whispers of alliance, messages scratched on bark, passed hand to hand during field breaks, supplies hoarded for a distant flight. The scars of old treacheries lingered, a brother turned informant. Met with isolation that broke more than body, but they tempered resolve into cunning, families forging invisible bonds stronger than the chains that bound them outwardly. In the broader tapestry of the county, Hawthorne's illusion of benevolence endured, his ledgers a bulwark against scrutiny. Spring assemblies hailed his innovations in crop rotation, veiling the true rotations of lives reshaped in secrecy. A surveyor, mapping boundaries for expansion, stumbled upon Lyra's cabin during a perimeter check, his questions deflected by overseers with tales of quarantined illness. Hawthorne's exchanges with the Philadelphia advisor soured into recriminations, the doctor's missives warning of degenerative echoes in tampered lines. Accounts of northern trials, where similar ambitions yielded frailty and early graves. Elias retorted with defiance, his ailment deepening into feverish nights, yet he pressed onward, incorporating Lyra's etchings, discovered and confiscated, into his theories as instinctual diagrams of inheritance. Mid-spring unfurled another absence. The carpenter, summoned for reassessment after his pairing, yielded a child with subtle anomalies, vanished under cover of a storm. His wife combed the rain-lashed woods, unearthing a splintered tool handle etched with a plea, but the narrative spun of evasion, a desperate bid for freedom that quelled the murmurs. Suspicion coiled toward the big house, where Hawthorne's gatherings multiplied. Allies drawn from shadowed networks to behold the evolving miracle. Lyra, paraded in dim light during one such assembly, felt their gazes like brands, her skin's glow a betrayal of her inner fire. Mama Roo, overhearing fragments from a kitchen hand, smuggled a shard of mirror to her, urging reflection not on vanity, but on the symbol's power. "See the map you draw, it's for those who follow," she urged, her touch a fleeting anchor. As blooms dusted the fields, Hawthorne's vision crested in hubris, blueprints for a sanctuary quarter, sketched for the immune elite he envisioned. Clara confronted him in a rare outburst, her words laced with pleas for mercy, but he silenced her with visions of a plague-proof dynasty, his cough masking the irony of his own unraveling. The plantation's facade cracked subtly, yields dipping from sabotage seeds, overseers' reports tinged with unease. Yet the silence held, propped by complicit institutions that profited from the hush. In Elena Vargas's modern vigil, the attic's artifacts painted a fuller portrait. Journal passages detailing the 1851 expansions, cross-referenced with oral echoes from descendants who recalled the marked ones as harbingers of both shield and sorrow. Buried tribunal files from 1905 surfaced a Hawthorne widow's vague deposition, alluding to unorthodox preservations that haunted the estate's sale. Conversations with living kin unveiled patterns, resiliences shadowed by chronic frailties, stories of a girl's blight as the thread-binding silenced generations. The sought immunity, revealed in fragments, emerged not as salvation, but as a cruel facsimile, its legacy a mosaic of endurance etched in loss and longing. The hawthorn veil thinned with each unearthed layer, Lyra's persistent mark a beacon through the fog of forgetting, calling forth the truths that time's mercy could not fully bury. Summer's merciless blaze scorched Hawthorne Plantation in 1851, the sun a relentless inquisitor baking the red clay until it cracked like the fissures in Lyra's afflicted skin. The cotton fields writhed under the heat, bolls bursting prematurely in the parched rows, in mockery of the abundance Elias Hawthorne still professed in his fevered dispatches to distant confidants. The big house, once a bastion of ordered grandeur, now hummed with an undercurrent of frenzy, its halls lined with Hawthorne's proliferating charts, sprawling diagrams of bloodlines that snaked across walls like veins exposed to light. Lyra, at 17, embodied the pinnacle of his delusion, her white blight a radiant armor against the season's sweltering plagues. Mosquito clouds descended on the quarters, carrying the whisper of malaria that laid low the strongest hands, yet they parted around her like smoke from sacred ground, her patches glowing with an unnatural luster that Hawthorne hailed as the dawn of invincibility. Isolated in her cabin, Lyra traced the evolving patterns on her body with numb fingers, the disease now a labyrinth of scales and sheen that pulled at her flesh with every breath. The immunity it conferred came at a steep toll. Waves of exhaustion crashed over her, leaving her limp and feverish in the humid afternoons, her visions sharpening into harbingers, shadowy figures of the enslaved marching in unison, their chains dissolving into dust under a blood-red moon. The world beyond her walls filtered in through the barred slits, the rhythmic thud of hoes in the earth, the muffled sobs of a mother whose child had succumbed to the very fevers Lyra defied. Mamaru's arrivals grew perilous, the old woman navigating the overseer's patrols like a ghost in the underbrush, bearing meager gifts of river water and crushed herbs to soothe the cracks that wept in the heat. "Your light burns brighter than his shadows, child," she confided one sweltering eve, her hands steady as she applied a poultice, eyes alight with the fire of forbidden hope. But Lyra's replies dwindled to murmurs, her spirit a flickering ember, sustained by the etchings on the walls, symbols now dense with meaning, a cipher of resistance passed in dreams to those who might one day decipher it. Hawthorne's program of coerced lineages had metastasized into a suffocating regime, ensnaring the plantation in its tendrils. He interrogated the enslaved with a zeal that bordered on interrogation, extracting fragments of ancestral lore under the pretext of communal welfare, weaving them into his grand design. A field woman whose forebears had traversed fever-riddled coasts was yoked to a stable hand marked by survival through recurrent chills, their union a calculated fusion in the stifling confines of a remote shed. Refusals met with inexorable consequences. Families cleaved like felled timber, the young bartered to far-flung markets that swallowed identities whole. Clara Hawthorne, her once composed demeanor frayed at the edges, oversaw the allotments of tainted sustenance with a detachment born of resignation, her private journal filling with cryptic entries on the burdens of foresight. In quiet hours, she wandered the verandas, gazing at the quarters where lights winked like distant stars, her complicity a growing spectre that haunted her prayers, unraveling the threads of her devout facade. The quarters seethed with a subterranean fury, the collective soul of the oppressed coiling tighter against the vice of exploitation. Etta's child, now a lanky youth of 6, with the blight's faint remnants veiled by growing strength, became a quiet talisman among the young, his unscarred vigor a subtle rebuke to Hawthorne's machinations. Elders convened in the veil of night, their gatherings masked by the chorus of cicadas, voices weaving plans from whispers, roots etched in memory for those bold enough to flee. Old Silas, his frame bent but unbowed, struck sparks from his anvil that mirrored the defiance in his words. The master's bargain trades our essence for his ghost of eternity. But ghosts fade, While roots endure, he proclaimed to the shadowed circle, his gaze piercing the dark. Acts of veiled insurgency proliferated, irrigation ditches clogged with deliberate debris delaying the crop's thirst. Messages concealed in quilt patterns, signaling solidarity across the divides. The ghosts of prior betrayals, loved ones sacrificed to the overseer's favor, tempered their boldness into strategy, forging a resilient web that Hawthorne's gaze could not fully penetrate. The county's official narrative clung to its polished veneer, portraying Hawthorne as an architect of enduring prosperity. His innovations toasted at harvest suppers, where brandy dulled inquiring minds. A local physician, summoned for a routine consultation, caught wind of the quarantined specimen during a house call. His probing questions met with evasions and a purse heavy with silver. Correspondence with the Philadelphia Scholar devolved into dire admonitions, tales of collapsed experiments where engineered resilience birthed hidden weaknesses, lines that thrived briefly only to wither in unforeseen agonies. Hawthorne scorned the warnings, his own cough evolving into a rasping harbinger. Yet he accelerated, drafting manifestos for a preserved enclave where the immune would till the fields untroubled by disease. Late summer claimed another soul. The laundress, her pairing deemed a failure after birthing a frail infant, disappeared amid a thunderstorm's roar. Her kin sifted the sodden earth at first light, recovering a sodden locket inscribed with vows of reunion, but the overseers decreed it a willful flight, their threats silencing the grief-stricken chorus. Whispers intensified toward the big house, where Hawthorne's nocturnal convocations drew veiled figures from allied estates, their examinations of Lyra a ritual of avarice masked as science. She stood before them in the flickering lamplight, her skin's iridescence a defiant glow, feeling their scrutiny as an assault on her very core. Mama Rue, intercepting a servant's tale of the assembly, conveyed a fragment of cloth etched with a protective rune, pressing it into Lyra's grasp. "This binds the unbroken. Wear it against the night," she implored, her voice a bulwark against despair. As the heat waned into harvest's frenzy, Hawthorne's empire teetered on delusion's edge, his visions of a plague-defying dynasty clashing with the plantation's subtle decay, fields yielding less despite the toil, overseers murmuring of unrest. Clara's confrontations escalated into tearful pleas, her words falling on ears deafened by ambition, the couple's bond straining under the weight of shared sins. In the stark fluorescence of Elena Vargas's research haven in 2024, these veiled chronicles coalesced into revelation. The attic ledger's passages on the summer assemblies intertwined with unearthed diaries from Hawthorne descendants, confessing the selective preservations that perpetuated the blight's echo through bloodlines. Forgotten probate records from 1910 hinted at a family schism over inherited anomalies, while dialogues with Lyra's far-flung progeny unveiled recurring patterns, bolstered constitutions shadowed by elusive frailties, oral sagas of a girl's luminous curse as the forge of silenced endurance. The immunity, unmasked in hindsight, stood as a hollow triumph, its fabrication a tapestry of coercion that scarred souls across eras. The Hawthorne enigmas, long interred in complicit quietude, surged toward exposure, Lyra's tenacious mark, a luminous guide through oblivion's veil, evoking the inexorable march of truths once consigned to shadow. If this story has already hooked you, leave a like. This helps Lyra's story reach more people. Autumn's chill descended on Hawthorne Plantation like a shroud in 1851, the leaves turning to embers that mirrored the fading fire in Elias Hawthorne's eyes. The harvest had come and gone in a whirlwind of frenzied labor, the cotton wagons groaning under loads that masked the deepening fissures in the estate's foundation. The big house, once a monument to unyielding authority, now creaked with the weight of unspoken reckonings. its walls echoing the rasps of Hawthorne's worsening cough, a cruel echo of the plagues he sought to conquer. Lyra, her 18th year marked only by the relentless advance of her affliction, remained the silent epicenter, her skin a testament to twisted ambition. The white blight had woven itself into an intricate veil across her body, its luminous patches repelling the autumnal chills that claimed the unwary, yet exacting a toll that hollowed her from within. Fevers brushed the quarters like spectres, but Lyra stood untouched, her survival a beacon that Hawthorne interpreted as divine endorsement, even as his own strength ebbed. From the dim confines of her cabin, Lyra observed the plantations unraveling through the narrow slits that passed for windows, her etched symbols on the walls now a faded gallery of endurance, circles and rivers that spoke of unity beyond chains. The disease had stabilized into a cruel equilibrium, the scales flaking in the crisp air, leaving her raw but resilient, her visions clearer than ever. Processions of shadowed figures breaking free, their forms dissolving into starlit freedom. The isolation had forged in her a quiet steel, her murmurs to Mamaru carrying fragments of resolve. The old woman, her steps ever more cautious amid the overseer's tightened patrols, arrived with tales of brewing storms, rumors of federal agents probing southern estates, whispers of emancipation's distant thunder. The tide turns slow, but it turns, Mamaru breathed one foggy morning, pressing a bundle of dried roots into Lyra's hands, her touch lingering as if to impart the ancestor's unyielding pulse. Yet Lyra's gaze held a profound weariness, her body a vessel strained to breaking. The immunity Hawthorne coveted now, a double-edged inheritance that bound her tighter than any lock. The program of enforced pairings had reached its zenith, a clandestine engine that churned lives into Hawthorne's vision of fortified blood. He orchestrated the final alliances with desperate precision, drawing on every scrap of law to pair those with echoed traits, survivors of old outbreaks linked in the hush of barns, their unions a grim calculus veiled in necessity, refusals dissolved into separations that scarred the soul. A father vanishing after protest, his family left to grieve in fractured silence. Clara Hawthorne, her piety eroded to ash, administered the last of the laced rations with hands that trembled uncontrollably, her diary's pages filled with pleas for absolution that she could never voice. In the quiet of her chamber, she confronted Elias one final eve, her words a torrent of suppressed anguish over the perversion of creation, but he waved her away, lost in sketches of an immune dynasty that would eclipse the fevers forever. Their bond, once a pact of shared dominion, fractured irreparably, Clara's silence giving way to solitary vigils where she burned Hawthorne's marginal notes, the flames devouring evidence of the human cost. In the quarters, the weight of cumulative loss forged a collective resolve, the enslaved community a tapestry of quiet fortitude against the encroaching dark. Etta's youth, now a sturdy 10-year-old with the blight's subtle remnants woven into his skin, became a symbol of inadvertent legacy, his quick hands aiding in the subtle acts of defiance, signals flashed in field patterns, supplies cached for the bold who dreamed of northern soil. Old Silas, his voice a gravelly anchor, gathered the remnants of his circle in the forge's dying embers, his words igniting sparks of hope. This master's delusion ends not in glory, but in the dust he sows, he declared, eyes scanning the night for betrayers. Their resistance culminated in coordinated whispers, a night of loosened gates, tools hidden to halt the final shipments, a ripple of unrest that rippled outward. The betrayals of yore, a kin's coerced confession leading to public correction, had taught them caution, but also the power of persistent memory, families clinging to oral threads that preserved the truth against erasure. The county's complicit hush began to crack as autumn waned. A federal auditor, dispatched amid growing abolitionist scrutiny, arrived under guise of tax review, his ledgers noting discrepancies in Hawthorne's yields subtly undermined efforts that hinted at deeper malaise. Whispers from the preacher's return sermons pierced the elite gatherings, decrying tamperings with providence that invited divine retribution. Hawthorne's letters to the Philadelphia contact ceased abruptly. The Doctor's Final Warning, a treatise on the illusory veil of engineered vigor, where such pursuits birthed hidden frailties, unheeded as Elias's cough turned to blood-flecked spasms. In a final, delusional assembly, he paraded Lyra before his dwindling allies, her form a glowing emblem of triumph, but the sight stirred unease, one guest departing with murmured doubts that seeded future inquiries. Winter's first gale claimed Hawthorne in 1852, his body succumbing to the very spectre he defied, his death shrouded in official tales of exhaustion from noble labors. Clara, inheriting the estate, ordered the journals and charts consigned to flames, but fragments escaped, tucked into attics, buried in ledgers that time would exhume. Lyra, spared the pairings by her isolation, faded into obscurity, her fate whispered as a quiet passing in the spring thaw, her symbols etched on the cabin walls crumbling with the structure itself. The program dissolved in the founder's wake, pairings abandoned amid the chaos of war's approach, but its echoes lingered in the bloodlines. Faint anomalies passed down like unspoken curses. In 2024, Elena Vargas's revelations crested in the attic's dim glow, the pieced-together ledger unveiling the full horror. Hawthorne's pact, a forbidden alliance with science and silence, had forged not immunity but a legacy of veiled suffering, descendants bearing resilient traits shadowed by chronic echoes of the blight. Stories unearthed in DNA traces and oral archives. Tribunal files from 1887, long sealed, confessed fragments of the selective preservations, while interviews with Lyra's kin painted portraits of survival laced with loss, their persistence a quiet triumph over forgetting. The secret revealed through osadas in forgotten wells and charred letters exposed the systematic cruelty masked by elite benevolence, the institutional erasures that silenced generations. Yet in this tardy justice, memory stirs from slumber. The Hawthorne plantation's shadows, once buried in red clay, now whisper of resilience. The enslaved's unyielding spirit, Lyra's marked endurance a flame that pierces the veil of oblivion. These truths, clawed from history's grip, demand we listen, lest the silences repeat. Justice arrives late, but it arrives, honoring the voices that refuse to fade. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Hawthorne Plantation. See you in the next video.